Great, thank you. We are excited to be here and talk about Zero Trust. My name is Ivan Dwyer. I'm on the product marketing team here at Okta.
And I'm Nick Fisher, also on the product marketing team here at Okta. Both Ivan and I have had a lot of discussions with customers around Zero Trust and sort of that emerging security model. And we're going to talk about some best practices, what we're hearing, and share some insights on how a lot of our customers are thinking about enabling Zero Trust security model.
Yeah, I think one of the things we want to do today is kind of blow past some of the hype and theories surrounding Zero Trust and really get down to brass tacks and some actual action items. Because I think we're at the point now where we know enough about the model, but everyone's got initiatives at their jobs that we want to kind of tie to Zero Trust and see if we can get some of the positive security and productivity outcomes as promised by the model in our actual practitioners' work.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of hype around it. Yeah. So we want to talk about, I want to start by talking a bit about what really led to the rise of Zero Trust and sort of the way we work today and why that no longer really works for securing the organization. So as a lot of the people on this webinar probably know, the original, the way of securing the organization, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, was more around creating a secure moat around the organization, often in the form of a network perimeter, where everything inside of that safe perimeter was considered trusted, sort of a full trust model, and everything outside of that was considered untrusted. And this led to actually the rise of several breaches, whereby if someone was able to penetrate that secure moat, so to speak, and get the keys to the castle, based on the flat architecture of that of the infrastructure, they were able to sort of move laterally east-west and accelerate and improve, basically get more permissions and compromise the organization. And there was also the risk of providers who had more trust than they needed to. So this concept of a full trust model did start to break down. And also, as we know, the traditional perimeter has dissolved with things like the move to mobile and cloud-based services. We have various different people, whether it's employees, contractors, partners, customers, privileged users, are all trying to access various resources from any network, any device, any location. And this is really the way we work today. So the result is that we can really no longer assume trust based on where you are within the network. And so that really requires this new way of thinking about securing the organization. So going from that full trust model to Zero Trust. And I will acknowledge that the term Zero Trust also is, we do need some level of trust to do our jobs, right? It's really more of a getting rid of the idea of sort of trust is assumed based on where you are, but thinking more about how trust adapts to the risk profile. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing about, Zero Trust is you can't just declare the network untrusted and call it a day. That's not going to get you anywhere fast. So if we kind of take that macro view of our workforce and the environments we're trying to protect, it's really about connecting our people to our resources securely. So it kind of reasons in that sense to make people the new perimeter. And when people are the perimeter, identity is king. But in order to do this effectively, we need to shift our access controls from the network layer to the application layer. So this is where we're getting away from the binary decision of in the network or out of network. And the way to do this is setting a core identity layer that's going to lay the groundwork for everything else. But identity has kind of changed with this seismic shift as well. We're not just talking about a static user record in a database anymore. Identity is more dynamic. It's the user's roles. It's the devices they're using. It's their location. Essentially, anything that can impact someone's security posture becomes context to make a smarter access decision. And so when you have dynamic decision-making in place, the controls are able to adapt to all of these changing environments in real time. You're continually assessing trust. So if you just start with default Zero Trust, you earn trust by your user information, your device information. So all of this context allows you to earn trust, because at the end of the day, we do need to connect our people to our resources securely. So we're just saying Zero Trust by default, we're going to earn it based on context. And when you have a good identity layer at the foundation, you're really able to do that effectively. So we always say people in a perimeter, identity becomes the foundation of the Zero Trust strategy.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes you'll hear almost these like buzzwordy phrases like, we're in a post-perimeter world, or the perimeter's disappeared. But I mean, in reality, like there are just more elements and more stages whereby you need to make trust-based decisions. So really, there is a perimeter that exists, and we believe that extends beyond something like the network these days. And the way people are working, that's proven out. Identity being that single control point across devices, users, networks, locations.
Post-perimeter world, that sounds like a potential dystopian sci-fi that's future. We have no perimeters anymore. We're still talking about computer security here. Don't worry. Cool. So we kind of have an idea of what we're trying to accomplish, but what does that actually look like in practice? So if we kind of revisit that first picture that Nib was talking about, it's about connecting people to resources. And the way to do this is we've got to bridge the gap effectively, and we have this kind of concept of a reference architecture in between. Now, this is a simplified view, and every company, every organization is going to have a different kind of perspective on how to build this from a system perspective. But I like to put it in this context because at least it outlines the layers and the types of things that you need to inject into your own architecture to make this happen. So if we move from bottom up, we kind of talked about it already with this core identity as the foundational layer. This gives us a unified environment for all of our people. And without kind of a master environment for the people accessing resources, I mean, you have full-time employees, you've got contractors, you've got partners. It just becomes too difficult to put in place the right access controls. So I'm really going to stress again how important it is to get this kind of identity foundation right. But in order to make smarter trust decisions in kind of a zero trust world, we need the right context surrounding this request. Now, it's a matter of gathering as much contextual information in real time as you possibly can, and having a policy framework that understands it. So collecting device information and then understanding how to trust the policy that says this device is trusted because it's an inventory, it's got AV installed, it's got the disk encrypted and firewall enabled. Now, it's a combination of collecting that information, having a policy engine that can understand it, and then enforcing that in real time. That's not an easy task. So one of the things we talk about is you don't have to have all of this on day zero. It's kind of, the more you have, the smarter you can be. But it's important to kind of lay the foundation of access controls and then inject context as you're able to collect it more and build policy over time. And you just get smarter and smarter. So all of this context feeds into the identity and access layer. This is the smarts. So this is where we're doing all of the core authentication, authorization, and then inspection on the back end. If you're familiar with Cisco's AAA framework from back in the day, this is really just a modern approach on that. The key difference, though, is we're talking about granular layer 7 access controls instead of network controls, and really more dynamic enforcement of policies. And if you have an identity and access layer that can effectively authenticate a user and a device, authorize based on policies and roles, and then be able to inspect all of the traffic and decisions that were made, that feeds into the actual resources. But a company's resources are vast. It's not just SaaS applications. We've got a lot to deal with. We want to bridge access controls to the infrastructure layer, to the API layer, to the application layer. This is really the end tiers of your corporate architecture. And a lot of it's on-prem and a lot of it's in the cloud. So in order to do this, every environment has different protocols, different credentialing mechanisms, different ways to connect. As a zero trust architecture, we want to abstract as much of that as we can from our users as possible. What you don't want to have to do is have your people connecting to resources and jump around and have to enter in different passwords at different times using different keys and things like that. The more we can abstract and just broker secure connections between people and resources, I think the better off we'll be. But that means building the model and the architecture to support a lot of that. And that's the kind of stuff that we focus on a lot here at Okta, is abstracting a lot of those complexities of securely connecting people to resources. Now, this is definitely a major area of focus for Okta. And if you may have seen the recent ScaleT acquisition, which is where I came from, ScaleT was working on zero trust access for servers. So, Okta has great SaaS application, API access. Now we've got infrastructure access, really rounding out the whole corporate network. And this is a really nice picture for us to kind of drive towards. And there's obviously a lot of implementation details, but I like this view of it because at least it frames it in some sort of kind of reference architecture.
Yep, I like that. Yeah, and just to kind of recap a bit what Ivan was just talking about, where access is given based on trust, and trust is really determined based on context. And so I want to share some insights from how our customers are thinking about context as it relates to trust, and actually some of the policies that are often set when you're trying to start on the zero trust path. And so I'm going to go through this contextual access management framework here, and we can start to think about trust in a couple different levels. There's sort of the what I would call sort of the more fundamental components of trust, which is one, the identity of the user of that device. Who are they? Are they in a certain high-risk user group, for example, whereby a higher level of trust will be required in order to grant access based on maybe them being a higher risk target for attack? What is the resource they're trying to access? Is this critical infrastructure? Is this a sort of a low-risk task manager application, or is this something really high risk that we need to set a stricter policy around access for? So starting to map your resources and the identity of your users is one of the first components that fold into a policy framework around contextual access. And then we get more into this what we call adaptive context or advanced context, right? Where we're looking at things beyond just the identity and the resource, but things that are likely to change, like the network context. Is this user logging in from a new IP address we've never seen them log in from before, or on a specified IP zone, or outside of that specified IP zone? This could be a corporate network. Now, while we don't think IP addresses are a great way to gate trust, and in the spirit of zero trust, we need to look at other elements of context, they can be an element of risk to consider. And actually, a lot of our customers do set policies based on if logging in from outside the corporate network, you might have a stricter access policy there. And then looking at things like network anonymizers, right? Things like, are they trying to access from a Tor browser, right? Another indicator of risk. So moving on from network context, we then have categories like device context. So we can say, is this a new device we've never seen them log in from before, based on a deviation from a fingerprint that Okta has taken of that device? This can be an assessment of risk. And then, is this a managed device or not? So this is actually a very common policy that our customers set, looking at device management state using tools like VMware or other UEMs in the space. And this also hints at the fact that there's a whole ecosystem of zero trust players that go beyond just the user identity, but also looking at things like device identity to determine things like device trust. So if you can establish that device is trusted, you can have more lenient access decisions, reduced friction around that. And we'll talk about some of the ways our customers are doing that. But that is a very common policy we see today. If device managed and maybe on the corporate network, then have a more relaxed access policy because there's a high level of user trust and device trust. And then finally, location context. So this is also a pretty common policy we see. Are they logging in from a new city, state, or country, a new geolocation? Maybe you don't have a lot of users in China, and you would not expect a contractor or an employee to access one of your accounts from there. So maybe setting up either a blacklist or a stricter authentication policy based on location. Or is their authentication attempt representative of some impossible travel pattern? They're logging in from 2 p.m. Pacific time, and then again from 3 p.m. Pacific time, going from San Francisco to New York. Like, that's an impossible travel situation. So that could be an indication of risk you want to set policy on. And then taking in all this context together to issue what we call a contextual response. And this could be prompting for a second factor. And we'll talk about some of the best practices for factor assigning to users based on risk, but also do you straight up allow or deny access or raise an alert, right? So these can be either discrete policies you would set on one of these things, like if device is managed, have a more relaxed authentication policy or a more relaxed response. Or we can start to look at these things in aggregate and look at the overall risk associated with that authentication attempt by taking a bunch of inputs that could indicate risk. Again, so it's aligning trust to this context and making decision together. So in reality, like, beyond zero trust, there's probably a better term for this, maybe more like adaptive trust or dynamic trust, where trust changes based on different elements of risk. And assigned to grant access. Yeah.
And if you do this right, you get the Holy Grail, right? So the Holy Grail, and this sounds very nice to say out loud, is you have the right people, have all the right levels of access to the right resources with the right context, and we're continually assessing that. And we want to do this with least friction possible. This is really important because traditionally security is seen as a blocker, right? And what we've seen in kind of the digital transformation of the last decade around, enabling teams to move faster with cloud infrastructure and cloud resources. So zero trust is kind of doing the same for security. Instead of security being the blocker, security is being more of an enabler. because all of these things are happening behind the scenes. And if you can streamline a lot of these workflows where it's continually assessing risk and adapting to changing environments versus having to hop around different networks all the time and enter in different passwords. The idea is that if you have enough information about this request, you can make the smart decision. And to end users, they appreciate that. And so this is kind of why we want to see the outcome. But the outcome, that's the holy grail. Let's take a step back, because I do find it useful to kind of pull out some of these pain points that have just continued to plague IT and security departments. Now, if you think about it, the zero trust model didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It came from decades of pain and people trying different ways. And it was kind of revolutionary to take a new approach at it. But at the same time, what we want to make sure that we understand is, what are the initiatives that we have at our companies? What are the pain points that we're trying to solve for today? And how can we align that to this kind of zero trust model? And, and when we talk to our customers all the time, this is just a short list of some of the things that they're experiencing. We talk about having, laying an identity layer as the foundation. Well, if you have multiple user stores that have, speak different languages, you have no real source of truth. That's going to get you in a lot of trouble to add access controls because you don't know who's accessing what. And similarly, you've got password sprawl. You have no idea what the credentials people are using to access different things. There's a lot of things. Anything here you want to call out, Nick? There's so many.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a new problem, right? We've been dealing with this problem for 10 years or more, and this problem of access management is just often the result of the fact that there's just a lot of complexity under the hood that the large organizations are dealing with now, right? You have multiple Active Directory forests. You're trying to provide secure access and unified access policies for on-premise resources as well as emerging cloud resources, whether it's cloud applications or, as I've been talked about, infrastructure as a service, and employees, but trying to provide secure access to people like contractors or partners. So the one in the bottom left, there's no way to grant contractors temporary access. This is definitely a problem we hear a lot from customers, right? You don't want to put contractors typically within your Active Directory master, and in partners as well. So how do you grant them secure access, and how do you provide that access in a unified policy that makes sense for that risk profile? And using sort of a cloud-based directory service is one way a lot of our customers are trying to solve that, is sort of having a universal directory layer on top of that. But these pain points are definitely still existing today, as a lot of organizations are moving to the cloud, and that's a journey for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One that I hear a lot from is when we talk to various TV and movie studios, the content that they're producing is incredibly sensitive. I mean, how many times have we seen a series leak before it was supposed to be launched? So that's something that these TV movie studios fret about all the time. But the people that are working on those, are temporary daytime employees that, have access to basically all of that footage. And it really is a pain point for a lot of those folks. So that's just something I've seen that one a lot. Other ones I see a lot. We talked on device management. This is a challenge for a lot of organizations as you grow. Past the kind of BYOD policy, you might want to start enforcing some device inventory. You want to make sure that you only have managed trusted devices across your workforce at scale. That's a really challenging one.
Yeah.
And then, when you're talking about network access, so you read a lot about a lot of the breaches, and you kind of go back and read the breach reports. This is stuff that has, they didn't find or discover until, weeks, months, years after it actually happened, and just not having any visibility because you're just dealing with pure network traffic. So this is another reason why we want to shift the controls up to layer 7, is we have better inspection, we have better ability to see who's accessing what and when and from where. And if something seems off, we've got the right alerting and contextual access mechanisms in place to put forth either raising an alert or denying access. So a lot of these things kind of come up. We don't want to scare anyone here, but this is probably day-to-day practice for a lot of you folks. So what's the next step to get to zero trust? Because zero trust seems like this really monumental task, right? So a lot of the things as we kind of break this down into a maturity curve. You don't have to peak Mount Everest on day 0, there are things you can do to get to base camp. So
right.
I'll let Nick jump in.
Right. Yep, exactly. And so whether your organization has this broad-based zero trust initiative that you're going towards, or you're starting with more bottoms-up zero trust projects, there's typically a maturity curve that we're seeing our customers follow. And it really starts with acknowledging, like, what is the today state, right? What is stage 1? And that's often where organizations find themselves in this state of fragmented identity, especially these large organizations we talked about earlier that are moving to the cloud and have a lot of complex infrastructure, both on-premise and trying to embrace mobile and cloud, where you typically Active Directory is on-premises. There's little to no cloud integration across it. And then, as Ivan mentioned earlier, this idea of password sprawl, passwords everywhere, and that presents problems for the users, right? That's a bad user experience. We're not good at remembering strong, distinct passwords as humans. And then there's challenges for IT with, password resets, but also security. Really, this is, insecure password practices has led to the rise of all these credential-based attacks, like phishing, credential stuffing, password spray. I mean, it's a huge problem in this cloud world where really, if you get a password off the dark web, you often just simply need to log on instead of having to break in, right? It's really changed the attack vectors we see. And so as organizations are moving to the cloud, the rise in phishing attacks is one of the most common reasons where they start to think about the need for a new way to secure the organization. So that's really the stage 1 in acknowledging sort of what is the problem statements, and goes back a bit to the slide earlier.
Yeah, so if we think of the next phase is kind of base camp. So you get identity right. You got a unified identity layer, allows you to build the identity and access controls to your resources. So this is where you inject single sign-on for your employees, contractors, and partners. We obviously recommend adding multi-factor wherever you possibly can, having really strong authentication. And this gives you a chance, once you have a unified identity layer, you have a central control plane for enforcing policy across your resources. So that's app servers and APIs. But it's definitely important to make sure that you have the foundational identity layer before you build the access controls. Because you can't really go back across these disparate identity layers and try to add different access controls. You're just going to end up in a much more pain than you were before. And once you kind of get this right, you have things like automated provisioning, challenge. When you have a unified identity and central access, you can make sure that the right people only have access for the period of time that they need it to. And so this is where I would call this the minimum viable zero trust. But of course, we don't necessarily want to just stop at minimum viable. We talked a lot about making smarter trust decisions. So this is kind of where the next phase comes in.
Yeah, exactly. So once you pass stage 2, which is really, as Ivan mentioned, getting that control plane in place, making identity the single control point across users, devices, networks to enable that zero trust, those policies, then our customers start to think about what are those context-based access policies you want to set. So I shared some insights a bit earlier on policies such as location context. Is this user off the corporate network? Or device context, are they on a managed device? But there's a lot of inputs and discrete policies you can set that are based on the risk and trust level associated with that authentication attempt that we can start to set. So we're starting to align that access policy with the trust with that user. And then deploying multiple factors across user groups. So we talked a bit about, when we talked about contextual response earlier, the ability to deploy a second factor to really ensure that user is who they say they are in some of the riskier authentication attempts. But what we see a lot of our customers do is not necessarily just use one type of factor for all their users, but also start to align those factors with that user group. Because factors have different trade-offs of assurance and friction and sometimes even cost. So, something really basic like an SMS-based one-time password is not officially recommended by organizations like NIST because of how trivial it is to do these SIM swaps, walk into a cell carrier's retail shop and basically socially engineer them and get them to port over the phone number to your SIM number is actually quite trivial, and we're seeing that come up more and more. So using those methods to bypass and intercept those SMS one-time passwords is possible, but SMS-based two-factor is better than nothing. So there are some users who, for example, don't have smartphones, or maybe they're a little lower risk. And so that's something you would want to deploy for them. And then moving up the chain, we see many of our organizations deploying sort of push notification-based factors. So this is, typically a mobile app installed on a smartphone, and then with one tap, you say, yes, that is me trying to access Office 365 or whatever resource. And that is a pretty good balance between security and user friction. It's really lightweight and also isn't subject to some of those same, SIM swapping scams. But then on the higher end of the spectrum, you're looking at things like U2F tokens that use sort of modern standards like FIDO 2.0 that create a cryptographic handshake between the user and the service provider, the device and the service provider. And this is something that we see often deployed to really high-risk user groups like the C-suite or people that might be a target of a phishing attack. They tend to cost a bit of money because you have to buy the keys, but there are some really lightweight and powerful security U2F tokens through vendors like Yubico. Okay, so moving beyond that and having policies set up for factors and user groups is things like automated deprovisioning for people leaving the organization or changing roles, right? This is a pretty large security concern from an access standpoint, is making sure there's not this orphan apps whereby a contractor no longer is doing business with you, and yet they still retain access to critical applications for months or years if those aren't being watched. So making sure you have methods to manage the life cycle of these users, whether it's employees, contractors, or partners, so that access is cut off at the point of them leaving or changing roles. And some ways that our customers are solving this is actually mastering to things like HR systems that tend to be the source of truth for when someone leaves the organization or changes roles. So using tools like SuccessFactors or Workday and mastering from those instead of from Active Directory is an increasing trend we're seeing. And Okta has over 200 customers that are doing this today, which is really interesting. And then secure access to APIs. A lot of our customers are building, applications that are either customer facing or partner facing, like a partner facing web app or a customer facing mobile app. And, APIs are often the building blocks of these applications, and they can expose a lot of sensitive data to the web. And so making sure you scope those appropriately and provide secure access is sort of an emerging protection we're seeing a lot of our customers put in place as more and more breaches are the result of API leakage. So that's really stage 3. I'll pass to Ivan to talk about sort of.
Yeah, if you're doing all that, you are in a pretty good place. So what could possibly be the next phase, right? So this is the holy grail. If we're going to take it up a notch, I refer to this as the adaptive workforce. This is taking a lot of that contextual access and just continuing to inject smarter decision-making on this. So this is getting really granular with your kind of role-based access policies. So fine-grained access, least privilege access, having policies that can adapt in real time. So this is where we to do the buzzword bingo, we can inject some machine learning into our policy enforcement engine, where certain things might, obviously raise red flags, but certain things might actually we might let things through with less enforcement if they meet all of the contextual policies. This is where we can get into purely a passwordless experience, which frictionless access. Let's say every day at 9 a.m., Bob from HR logs in from the same workstation to the same web application, using his phone with it's in inventory and running AV and has multi-factor auth, and he's authenticated once. If there's a policy that, we can actually let that person through without having to enter a password every time. Now, this is where we're talking about security as an enabler. If we get good enough at our access controls and our ability to adapt to context effectively, we can enable the business by letting them go faster. So instead of having to log in every hour, things that check out, we're just going to let that through. Now, obviously, you've got to be careful. You have to be really good at stage 1 through 3 before you start to inject those types of controls. But the idea is, if you get there, that is the holy grail. This is the summit of Mount Everest, of the Zero Trust Mount Everest, and we've seen it. Only a handful of companies have gotten that far. Google's one with their BeyondCorp initiative, but we see a lot of companies on this path. And it's really nice to have this view at the light at the end of the tunnel, this kind of holy grail of an adaptive workforce. But again, we just want to stress that you don't have to tackle all of this at once. There's a lot of these things that you can be doing today that are going to get you on that path. And it's really important to take each in stride, because you can't really get to the next stage without getting the first one right. So starting with identity, moving into IAM, getting into contextual access, that's what gets you onto this adaptive workforce. And that's really, if zero trust is default state, adaptive workforce is the end goal. So,
So stage 4, then, if that is the summit of the Mount Everest of zero trust, Ivan, where would you say, which base camp would you say most of the organizations we talk to are at these days?
Yeah, I think base camp is getting just from stage 1 to stage 2. So if you get to stage 2, you're at base camp, you're healthy there. You've got some Sherpas that can help you from there. how far can we ride this analogy? But yeah, that's where kind of, minimum viable zero trust is getting to kind of a stage 2. And we help a lot of our customers get from 1 to 2. That's a big first step. And that's been core to Okta's business. But the more that we can get people to stage 2, the more we can add on stage 3 and stage 4. And we're seeing more of our companies that, have done, worked with Okta for the last year or two. They're like, hey, we've got a really good identity story now. What more can we do to be smarter? And that's where we kind of help people on that path. So it's exciting for us to kind of follow the journey with our customers, because we see how long, the paths they've taken. And it kind of validates our own thinking around this type of maturity curve.
Got it. Yeah. And I'll just double click a bit on that last one, frictionless access. One thing we can talk more about is really how a lot of our customers are trying to eliminate passwords from that authentication experience. And there's really interesting things we can do around that today with some of the new protocols in place. We don't have too much time to double click into that today, but I'll flag that as a way that our customers are looking to add more security while reducing friction. If you have high user and device assurance, you can enable some of those passwordless experiences. But just want to start to wrap up here. I want to talk about just a couple recaps here, a couple big takeaways. Really, one, there is no silver bullet for zero trust. You'll see some vendors come in and talk about how, buy us and you'll achieve zero trust. And that's really not how it often works. To the cloud, you embrace more mobile devices, and organizations are really trying to take a best of breed approach to adopting the apps that the business needs to do their job. And so making sure that you are working with an ecosystem of partners that fit your business needs, that also enable a zero trust framework is going to be key. So there's really not one vendor who's going to come in and solve zero trust for you. Strongly believe that based on the way we work, the zero trust journey starts with identity. And this is really bearing out in a lot of the ways our customers are enabling their zero trust and tackling their zero trust initiatives, where identity is that single control point across users, devices, and networks. And we believe that Okta is the modern zero trust platform. We are independent and neutral. We have over 6,000 different products in our integration network to integrate with, and we're a leader in the identity space. And so we can be that Sherpa on your summit to Mount Zero Trust.
I know what to get you for Christmas now.
I'm just gonna milk that analogy until it dies. Okay, and really this is, we have a lot of customers who are doing this today, and 21st Century Fox is a great example of this, where they're using Okta as the foundation of their zero trust model. And we're happy to share more details on a follow-up if you guys want to learn more about their journey. But we are seeing this more and more, and we're taking more and more inquiries from our customers on how Okta can be used for zero trust.
Yeah, another exciting thing to call out is Forrester, who initially coined the term zero trust, has kind of taken the lead at bringing it to market now, and the zero trust extended ecosystem. And they just launched their inaugural Forrester Wave. Nick and I both, met with the Forrester analysts a few times, walked through our product, walked through, our roadmap, our vision, and we performed very well. We are a strong performer in the inaugural Forrester Wave. And, I think one thing that was key was part of that process was, they talked to our customers, and our customers had a lot of really great things to say. And the fact that one of the headlines from the analyst was that our install base is in love with the solution, I think that just speaks volumes to our ability to help our customers on this path. So really excited to be a strong performer in that inaugural Forrester Wave, and we expect to continue to expand our vision of a zero trust platform for our customers. So I think that'll wrap up this piece. I think we've got a few questions, so let me just pop over here. Here's a good one. Oh, I love this one. Is this the same as BeyondCorp? So I'm going to go back to my Mount Everest analogy. BeyondCorp, for those who don't know, was an initiative at Google. So Google, this history was they were hacked by the Chinese government in 2009, 2010, and then there was they got into the network, and it was pretty bad. A lot of other enterprises got hit by it too. Most enterprises that got hit by it, their response was to go buy more firewalls, buy more VPNs. But Google saw this as an opportunity to kind of redesign their entire corporate architecture and corporate security network. And the story we've heard from the architects there was that Sergey got a crack team together, assembled them in the room, and said, okay, everybody, here's what I want to do. I want to redesign our corporate security network. I want it to work, and I want all of our users to love it. Now go. And they did. And 6 years later, they wrote a bunch of research papers about it. Now, the way I like to talk about BeyondCorp, and I spent years, the last couple of years, kind of promoting BeyondCorp as evidence that zero trust works and that it is possible. However, Google was in a very unique situation to do this. They had unlimited resources, unlimited time. They spent 6 years designing a system. They controlled all their employee devices. They controlled their infrastructure. They controlled their network. It was actually a very homogeneous environment for them to build such a complex system. Not every enterprise has that luxury. So what can we actually look at as BeyondCorp? I look at it as the Mount Everest. There's things that they wrote about and that they did that you can follow and learn from, but understanding that they had a very unique situation to be able to do that. So I try not to look at zero trust purely through the lens of Google. I like to have it there on the side as an example, as the marquee example of it done well. And again, it's just that nice to have that light at the end of the tunnel to know that there is this outcome that I'm driving towards. And the outcome for Google was they have a secure, adaptive workforce. They're one of the few that get to stage 4. And that was BeyondCorp. So good question. I love that. Let me take that one. Yeah.
Someone come in here. Not surprised we got this one. So how does a passwordless experience work? So I teased that one up a little bit when I was talking about the maturity curve. I'll flesh it out a little bit here. So there's a couple ways that our customers are enabling a passwordless experience now, and as you can imagine, the more trust and assurance you have about that user or device, the more frictionless that experience can be, and that's all in the spirit of aligning authentication experience with trust and security. So one of the ways we do it is through integration with UEM vendors like VMware, whereby if that device is considered trusted, that's a pretty high level of assurance. There's an MDM deployed on that device or a certificate installed. We can basically the user will initiate an access decision to something like Office 365. Okta will check with VMware to see if that device is managed, and if so, then we will grant access without prompting for a password. So that is an experience we can provide, and a lot of our customers are looking to do for trusted device managed scenarios. If the device is unmanaged, there's actually still some passwordless experiences that we can provide, and this is through a feature we call factor sequencing. And this is effectively just trying to treat the password like just another factor that can be sequenced in a chain of authentication prompts. So a scenario we see is if there's a high level of trust associated with some of the context we talked about earlier, like the users on the corporate network, it's not a new device, there's elements of trust. You can basically say, well, instead of prompting for a password, prompt for a push notification instead. So user types in their username, instead of then entering a password, they just get a lightweight push notification, and one tap, they say, yes, that is me, trying to access that, and then they're granted access to the system. And so that is a passwordless experience we can also enable based on certain trust scenarios. And we're seeing more and more interest in this. And we're also really excited because some of the protocols that are going to further enable passwordless experiences are coming to light. So these are things like WebAuthn. I'm using a FIDO 2.0 protocol. We're starting to see more of the major browsers support this. I think even recently Safari was indicated to be supporting this. So we're basically getting all the major browsers supporting this. We'll be able to do more things like using the biometric on your, built into the platform of, say, your laptop to do a primary authentication into a service. So we're really excited about the future of passwordless as protocols become more mainstream, and we're going to be there to support it.
Great. Yeah, that is pretty exciting. That is frictionless access at its finest. Okay, speaking of devices, does part of your model also understand the risks on the device, and does that affect access to resources, things like patch level OS version? Absolutely. So we touched on this a few times, but we talked about modern identity. Dynamic identity is not just a user record in a database. It is all of the surrounding context. And the device is very, very important context. So if I've got an unpatched device, that is potentially dangerous if I'm connecting to really sensitive company resources. So we absolutely want to enforce policy about device posture in the access control layer. Now, there's a few challenges there. We need to get that information into our control plane in an effective way where we have a real-time snapshot into that device posture. And then we also need to have a policy enforcement engine that can translate that device information and respond accordingly. So a lot of the contextual access controls we talked about are about the underlying authorization engine under the hood that's collecting that information and enforcing against the policy. And Okta's really good about having sign-on policies that are easily understandable from a manager perspective, but also that they're enforceable in practice. One thing I see a lot of is you can write policy all day, but if you can't actually enforce it, you have an adherence gap. So we actually want to be able to adhere to the policies. If your policy says only Mac OS devices with the latest OS can access a resource, we want to actually be able to enforce that policy, and that's hard. We spent a lot of time building a lot of that technology under the hood because the device is such an important piece of context. It's not the only piece of context, but it's incredibly important. So a lot of what we're trying to achieve is taking the identity piece, which is kind of a user on a device, and then being able to authorize based on that posture. Does this device meet the minimum state level of this resource? So for things like the company lunch menu, you don't really care if the device is up to date. But for, finance dashboard or some things like that have sensitive information, you absolutely care about the device posture. And again, it's the policy that can understand that context and then enforce on it accordingly. And you as an administrator can choose where you want to inject those policies. So a lot of cool things on our device posture and device context. Great.
All right.
Okay, I think that wraps it up for us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, guys. If you have further questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We can share more insights into how our customers are doing this today. And we have some white papers and customer journey case studies that can also provide a little more guidance on this. So thank you for joining.
Thank you.